So epistemology, I'd like to highlight a set of principles and concepts of epistemology, or theory of knowledge. All men by nature desire to know, as Aristotle claimed, but what is knowledge? That's the fundamental question. And actually, that's the subject matter of philosophical or specifically epistemological inquiry. You see, epistemology, that's the original term. It goes back etymologically to the term episteme, knowledge or scientific knowledge. Yeah. So that's a branch of philosophy that asks questions about knowledge, its nature, the conditions of knowledge, identifying the defining features of knowledge, making account of the sources of knowledge, and determining the limits of knowledge and justification. See, and you see there are three major categories, which are typically represented by traditional philosophical analysis of knowledge: the analysis of knowledge and justification, the analysis of knowledge in terms of its origin, and the viability of skepticism about knowledge and justification. I'm going to highlight some of these issues in this lecture. So I will start with the most extraordinary question: is the world knowable in principle? Though it may just come into contradiction with our common sense assumptions, because we do believe that we know something here, but that's a philosophical question which simply transcends our common sense and everything which is taken for granted. And I'd like to provide you at least some strategies of answering this fundamental question. First of all, what is the value of that question? What are the assumptions underlying this kind of question? The first assumption is, the basic assumption is that the universe is infinite and man is finite, and the cognition of that which is infinite is impossible within the boundaries of our finite experience. Yeah? And you see, there are three major positions which might be taken and identified as the positions determining the strategies of approaching the question of is the world knowable in principle. Optimism, agnosticism, and skepticism. Yeah? So the optimists assert that the world is in principle knowable. I guess that we are all optimists. The agnostics, on the contrary, reject the possibility of getting knowledge of the world. And the skeptics, they don't reject outright the knowability of the world, but they simply question the validity of our knowledge, but our claims to know something are justified. You see? And briefly, skepticism argues that no beliefs are justified and therefore no one really knows anything here. Original skepticism is the philosophical doctrine according to which one should refrain from making truth claims. And as Greeks claimed, we should exercise a kind of epoche, just refraining from making any truth claims or from claiming to know the ultimate truth. Yeah? Actually, know that there are lots of different forms of skepticism. Yeah? For instance, critical skeptics, they challenge, want to defend one's claims to knowledge, and then they attack that defense. And this might take the form of insisting that each claim one makes in that defense also be defended. And this is employed in the epistemic regress argument, for instance. A little bit later, I'll introduce you the structure of this epistemic regress argument, which is used in favor of foundationalism. Yeah? Substantive skepticism, for instance, specifies some criterion for knowledge or justification, then argues that some or all of our beliefs fail to meet this requirement. For instance, substantive skeptic might claim that to qualify as knowledge, the evidence supporting that belief must rule out all skeptical alternatives. Yeah, that's a very interesting criterion knowledge. Or Cartesian skepticism, It takes its name from the first of René Descartes, his Meditations on First Philosophy. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes employs the method of doubt to set up the skeptical challenge he addresses in the remainder of his work. He tries to determine the certain foundations for knowledge, and you see, I believe quantifies as knowledge only if it is indubitable, yeah, if it is absolutely certain, yeah. So there are lots of other forms of skepticism. Nevertheless, this may be taken as a very productive strategy of critical and reflecting thinking over the possibilities of getting knowledge and how to reject these skeptical claims, yeah, how to oppose to these skeptical claims is one of the major concerns of classical epistemology. Also, fallibilism, yeah, fallibilism is the philosophical doctrine that absolute certainty about knowledge is impossible, or at least that all claims of knowledge could in principle be mistaken. For instance, Karl Popper was a fallibilist, and when trying to identify the magic criterion for the demarcation of scientific knowledge and metaphysical or other forms of knowledge, he put forward the idea of falsification, actually, and rational criticism. Yeah, we can only subject our knowledge claims to expertise. We can criticize them and trying to check them on the basis of experience, for instance, or we can even try to check our claims to knowledge in terms of evaluating the logical consistency of our theories and their relation to empirical evidence. But empirical evidence can mainly just produce the basis for the falsification of our beliefs. And we are prompted to invent some new, bold, productive scientific theories which are able just to resist those falsifications. And they turn out to be empirically corroborated, but that doesn't mean that they are absolutely true. Yeah. Next, instrumentalism, for instance. Instrumentalism, that's another strategy or another way of paradigmatic thinking of the capacity to gain knowledge of something. This is actually the methodological view in epistemology. Concepts and theories are merely useful instruments, and their worth is measured not by whether the concepts and theories are true or false, but whether they correct depict reality and whether they make our experience intelligible, whether they can help us to structure our experience. And the worth of concepts and theories is measured by how efficient they are in explaining and predicting phenomena. So, and according to this instrumental view, the truth of an idea is determined by its success in the active solution of a problem. And with regard to this principle, instrumentalism is closely related to pragmatism, as you know. What about pragmatism? That's another paradigmatic trend. It is the view that considers practical consequences or real effects to be vital components of both meaning and truth. Yeah, as Ludwig Wittgenstein claimed that meaning of our verbal expression consists in how they're used in our language games. Yeah, so the meaning of any concept can be equated with the conceivable operational or practical consequences of whatever the concept portrays. And pragmatism asserts that any theory that proves itself more successful in predicting and controlling our world than its rivals can be considered to be nearer to the truth. Yeah. So, and pragmatists believe that truth is not ready-made. Yeah. The truth is made jointly by us and reality. Yeah. And some pragmatists also believe that truth is mutable and truth is relative to a conceptual scheme, though some philosophers such as Donald Davidson criticized this dualism of the content and conceptual scheme. We should study analytic philosophy in order to get some knowledge of this, a very profound approach. Okay, so What might be the kinds of knowledge? What might be the different kinds of knowledge? First of all, I'd like to draw your attention to the fundamental distinction between propositional knowledge and non-propositional knowledge. Yeah? We can identify at least three major kinds of knowledge. So the first one is in the focus of epistemological inquiries, propositional knowledge and knowledge that. Yeah? It is knowledge of facts or true propositions. For instance, Andrew knows that Caesar was assassinated, and the object of knowledge, or what is known, is the true proposition that Caesar was assassinated. So propositional knowledge is a relation between a subject and a true proposition, or a matter of fact. Another category is that of acquaintance knowledge. For instance, I know what it is like to feel pain, yeah? And I guess that some of you also do, but in alternative and broader sense, for instance, I can use this category of knowledge by acquaintance in the following mode. I know the president of the Russian Federation, for instance. So I can have a great deal of proposition knowledge about someone without having acquaintance knowledge. And practical knowledge, how-to knowledge. One can have the ability to do something without having much propositional knowledge about it. For instance, I know how to play a piano sonata or how to reinstall a new operational system on my computer. And traditional philosophers have been most concerned with propositional knowledge. You know that sometimes propositional knowledge is identified with a rather specific kind of knowledge, and the knowledge by description. And I'd like to draw your attention to this original difference between knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. Bertrand Russell, an influential British philosopher, logician, mathematician, historian, writer, Nobel laureate, he was the first to introduce this fundamental distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. I know that you have got this book written by Bertrand Russell, A History of Western Philosophy. So we'll start with knowledge by acquaintance. But actually, first of all, of course, we have to distinguish acquaintance as the basic cognitive awareness from the knowledge by acquaintance, because knowledge by acquaintance supervenes on this fundamental and basic cognitive awareness. Acquaintance. So Russell characterized acquaintance as a relation of direct awareness, a relation in which something is presented or simply given to the subject. Yeah? I'd like to cite Bertrand Russell. We shall say that we have acquaintance with anything of which we are directly aware, without either intermediary of any process of inference or any knowledge of truths. That means that in case of acquaintance, we've got direct cognitive access to something, and this access is not mediated by any process of inference. And I say that I'm acquainted with an object when I have a direct cognitive relation to that object, when I'm directly aware of the object itself. Yeah? For instance, if I'm feeling pleasure right now, yeah, then I have a direct cognitive relation to this mental state, yeah, to this qualitative or emotional state. And we have to specify this cognitive relation. What are the specific features of acquaintance? First of all, acquaintance is a non-judgmental and non-conceptual form of cognitive awareness. It means that acquaintance with something doesn't consist in forming any judgment or thought about it, or in having any concept or representation. You know that judgments, thoughts, and concepts are essentially intentional and representational in nature. They are about, or they represent other things, and we cannot do without judgments and without using concepts while forming our beliefs and transforming them into propositional knowledge. Secondly, acquaintance is a form of awareness constituting a real genuine relation, a relation that cannot obtain without its relator. That means that one can be acquainted with something that doesn't exist. There must be some causal relation, see? And judgment and concepts may represent or be about things that don't exist. Yeah? I can form quite coherently a concept of zombie living somewhere in a distant planet, yeah, when making this thought experiment in favor of the position that, for instance, mental facts cannot be derived from our knowledge of physical facts, yeah. So while generating propositional knowledge, we cannot do without concepts and judgments, yeah. And we can know lots of things by description just because we're acquainted with the first elements, the items of description, and they form the basis for our propositional knowledge. Nevertheless, propositional knowledge is mediated, and knowledge by acquaintance is not mediated by any concept or representation. And according to Russell, we can identify the following objects of knowledge by acquaintance. Conscious states of mind, first sense data, yeah, such as an experience of pain or a sensation of whiteness, yeah, as it appears to me. Also memory experience, introspective experience. Qualitative properties, for instance, universals, whiteness as such in abstraction, and particulars, this particular whiteness, yeah, of the ceiling in this classroom. Also mental facts and self. I'd like to cite Bertrand Russell because that was a rather problematic concept. Whether we're capable of having knowledge of knowing by acquaintance our self. When I see the sun, it often happens that I am aware of my seeing the sun in addition to being aware of the sun. And when I desire food, it often happens that I'm aware of my desire for food, but it's hard to discover any state of mind in which I'm aware of myself alone, as opposed to a complex of which I'm a constituent. So we become aware of ourselves within a certain context. We perceive ourselves in a complex of which we're constituents. Yeah. Okay. So, and I'd like to stress the point that anyway we have to distinguish this original raw cognitive awareness, which is categorized as acquaintance, from knowledge by acquaintance. There's a real difference. For a subject to be directly acquainted with something only requires for the subject to have immediate access to the object of awareness, have immediate access to my feeling pain, for instance, yeah, or to my sensation of whiteness when I look up at the ceiling in this classroom. And knowledge by acquaintance is a kind of knowledge. It requires the subject to hold a belief under the right conditions. And just compare these two propositions. Subject S is directly acquainted with P. S knows by direct acquaintance that P. Yeah? In order for the first proposition to be true, it needs to be the case that the subject is in fact acquainted with P. When P is the fact that one is experiencing pain, all it takes for this proposition to be true is that the subject has some unmediated access or awareness of his pain experience. And in order for the second proposition to be true, S knows by direct acquaintance that P, we have to use some fundamental, maybe, preconditional concepts or categories. For instance, a person may fail to attend to his experiences while feeling pain in such a way that he forms a propositional belief on the basis of his direct acquaintance with the pain experience. For instance, those who have never had an experience of feeling pain and they happen to experience it, actually they do not have any concept which enable them to identify the state, yeah, and to come out with these propositional claim that, for instance, I know by acquaintance that I'm feeling pain right now. So that's a very essential difference. Yeah, a person may be directly acquainted with his pain experience, but fail to have knowledge that he's having a pain experience. Just like, for instance, some animals, for instance, fish can be directly acquainted, yeah, with pain experience because something's going on here. nervous system, but actually it fails to have knowledge because it doesn't have language which enables to fix the concept of pain in the mind. Okay, so, and what about the relation between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description? Knowledge by acquaintance, to have knowledge by acquaintance occurs when just the subject has an immediate or unmediated awareness of some propositional truth. And knowledge by description, by contrast, is propositional knowledge that is inferential, mediated, indirect. And you know, Russell introduced his theory of descriptions. He claimed that by description, I mean any phrase of the form as so and so, that is indefinite description, or this so and so, that is definite description. For instance, a man is an ambiguous or indefinite description. The man with the iron mask is a definite description. Yeah. Or a president of the Russian Federation is indefinite description. But the president, yeah, I mean the president, which actually occupies this office, yeah. Now, just in the current political station, it turns out to be that we are dealing with definite description and without any other alternative. Okay, so, you know, knowledge by description is a purely propositional knowledge. Descriptions involve the use or application of concepts. In order to make descriptions, we use concepts and judgments. Descriptions inform the propositional content of our beliefs. And the propositional content of our beliefs can be articulated in a logical form of judgments or statements. And our judgments, as well as our beliefs, can be evaluated. They have truth values. They can be evaluated in terms of being true or false. A belief which is true forms the basis of propositional knowledge. Yeah? That means that if we're talking about propositional knowledge, the major constituent of it is a belief which is true. That is a propositional attitude. And description is the fundamental element of our propositional thought, which informs our belief, transformed into propositional knowledge. So, that's an interesting fact that, on Russell's view, we cannot know by acquaintance that physical objects exist. Yeah? And actually, he uses an interesting test in order to just determine with what we're acquainted. And this test consists in asking ourselves whether we can conceive of being in this very state when the predicate object of our awareness doesn't exist. If we cannot conceive of being in a certain state when the predicate object doesn't exist, we should reject the suggestion that we are directly acquainted with the item in question. So that's a very interesting and a rather strong argument. You see, for instance, I can have some knowledge, or I claim to have knowledge of the fact that there is a netbook in front of me here, but actually this cannot be the object of my knowledge by acquaintance, because, you know, the possibility of error or hallucinations involved. We should rule out acquaintance with physical object, future events and other minds and facts, because the possibility of errors involved. You know that the fundamental principle is that the object of our acquaintance must be something with which we should have a direct causal relation, for instance. So, it is the knowledge by description which provides the only possibility of knowing physical objects and facts. Yeah? Yeah, that's true. Once again, just we can have some knowledge of physical objects and facts, and we can transcend our experience. Once again, of course, we can rely on our empirical evidence. It seems that the evidence that my experiences give me right now for supporting the claim that there is a netbook, before me. It seems that my experience is perfectly consistent with the hypothesis that I'm now having a vivid dream, And if this is right, then the experiential evidence I possess cannot be that there's in favor of the fact that there is a laptop or a netbook before me. So even when our evidence for the presence of physical objects seems as good as we can get, then we are not acquainted with physical objects or their constituents. Next, another very important distinction is that between basic and inferential knowledge. So propositional knowledge is the knowledge of truths, or knowledge that involves a belief or judgment in some true claim or proposition. And according to Russell, knowledge by description is dependent on direct acquaintance. So knowledge by description depends on acquaintance for its propositional content. That's the first aspect of its dependence. Just consider the statement of Bertrand Russell. The fundamental epistemological principle in the analysis of propositions containing descriptions. Every proposition which we can understand must be composed wholly of constituents with which we are acquainted. And consider this example here. A person holds the belief that there is a cup of coffee. He is not directly acquainted with the coffee as a physical object, but he is able to think about the physical object through the items of description with which he is directly acquainted. Basically, he is directly acquainted with certain kinds of experience to which these items of descriptions correspond. So the descriptive content might consist of there being an object that is the cause of this experience of blackness, bitterness, hotness, liquidness, and we're capable of understanding when someone tells us that there was a cup of coffee on the table, because we are directly acquainted with experiences corresponding to the items of description, such as blackness, bitterness, hotness, and liquidness, you see. And the second aspect of how knowledge by description depends on acquaintance. It depends in the following way. You know that knowledge by description is inferentially dependent on knowledge by acquaintance. The fact is that propositions one knows by descriptions ultimately are inferred from one's propositional knowledge by acquaintance. And that means that knowledge by acquaintance is introduced as the most basic kind of knowledge, and these gave rise to the so-called foundationalist epistemology, in which all of one's knowledge is either foundational or inferentially based on foundational knowledge. So let's go further in our analysis. So that means that we have to discriminate between these two epistemic categories: inferential knowledge and non-inferential knowledge. Inferential knowledge, one has inferential or non-foundational knowledge, that P, for instance, that's a proposition, which we claim to know. When one's knowledge that P depends on one's knowledge of some other propositions from which one can legitimately infer P. There must be some inference, logical inference for it. Non-inferential knowledge, one has foundational or non-inferential knowledge that P, when one's knowledge that P doesn't depend on any other knowledge one has in this way. And of course, as I told you, this distinction is the precondition for foundationalism. So that means that some of our beliefs, they depend ultimately on some basic beliefs. And this fact is very important because foundationalism is one of the strategy which is used in order to analyze the structure of our inferential justification, which is one of the most important conditions of knowledge. If we go further, we'll try to make further distinctions and try to just work out some other categories which would help us to understand these aspects of propositional knowledge more profoundly. First of all, explicit and tacit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is self-consciousness, that the knower is aware of the relevant state of knowledge. Tacit knowledge is implicit, hidden from self-consciousness, And the fact is that inferential knowledge can be categorized as being tacit or implicit knowledge. Yeah? So Nicholas Rascher, for instance, proposed this interesting distinction between explicit, dispositional, and inferential knowledge. Explicit knowledge is a matter of what we can adduce on demand. It takes two principal forms: occurrent knowledge and dispositional knowledge. Occurrent knowledge, yeah, this is a matter of actively paying heed or attention to accepted information. Consider this example. A person can say, I am at this very moment considering or attending to or otherwise taking note of the fact that the hydrogen is the lightest element, yeah? Or the present evidence of our senses. I'm looking at the students in my class, yeah? That's another example. That's an occurrent knowledge, and this is the basis for our cognitive awareness of our situation, of our actual situation. Dispositional knowledge is a matter of what people would say or think if the occasion arose, of what, for example, they would say if asked. Yeah. For example, when even when someone is attending my lecture or sleeping here, we would say that an individual knows in the present relevant dispositional manner that Moscow is the capital of the Russian Federation. Here, those items of knowledge can automatically be rendered occurrent by suitable stimuli. I can ask you, what is the capital of the Russian Federation? Yeah. Going further, so what about inferential knowledge? Inferential knowledge, by contrast, is something deeply latent or tacit. It is not a matter that one can produce on demand this kind of knowledge. Yeah? It is a matter of what one would produce if only one were clever enough about exploiting one's occurrent and dispositional knowledge. We get some available knowledge and one can make inferences. If we are logically skillful, we can just come to some true conclusions. Yeah? One must think, reflect, try to remember, exert some intellectual effort and patience, and make use of logical rules, the rules of valid reasoning, yeah, in order to draw this inferential knowledge. So inferential knowledge is a matter of exploiting one's non-inferential, occurrent, dispositional knowledge. And the fact is that in attributing knowledge, epistemologists look not only to the information that people have in a more or less explicit way, but also to what they are bound to be able to infer from this. They use the so-called epistemic closure interest principle. And the general categories here is the available knowledge. Yeah? Available knowledge turns on not what the individual themselves can derive from their knowledge, but on what we can derive from it, so that something is known in this sense. Whenever, if Q is actually the case, X knows Q, and P can be derived from Q, it follows from Q. That's a logical relation. And there is a disjunctive specification of this concept. X knows that P if X knows P occurrently, or X knows P dispositionally, or P can be inferentially derived by using only those facts that X knows. See? Okay. Okay, going further, what might be the other categories of propositional knowledge? We can introduce lots of classifications. For instance, propositional knowledge can be classified by subject matter, mathematical or natural or physical knowledge, by source, personal observation, reliable reportage, testimony, or reasoning. Also, we can discriminate between these fundamental categories of a priori and a posteriori knowledge. By mode of justification or validation, personal experience, scientific investigation here. The cognitive status is also relevant. The cognitive status of the matters at issue, some empirical facts, convention and linguistic matters, formal relationships in logical mathematics. And by mode of formulation, we can formulate this knowledge verbally, by pictograms, by mathematical symbols or logical symbols. We can use a lot of languages in order to articulate the propositional content of our beliefs and knowledge. I think that once again I'd like to draw your attention to a very important distinction if we have to clarify this distinction between the sources of our knowledge and try to classify those sources. We are likely to encounter this distinction between a priori, non-empirical, and a posteriori, or empirical knowledge. So a priori, knowledge is possible independently or prior to any experience and requires only the use of reason. A posteriori, or empirical, knowledge is possible only subsequent, posterior to certain sense experience, in addition to the use of reason. Yeah? So that distinction forms the basis for the divergence of the positions of empiricism and rationalism. So, let's turn to the traditional analysis of knowledge. What is propositional knowledge? How to analyze the very concept of knowledge? The traditional attempts to define knowledge come in two main families. So, the first, knowledge is treated as some clever form of belief. And the best known form of this use, the so-called G2B definition. Knowledge is some kind of belief which is both justified and true. That's the classical definition, which goes back to Plato and his dialogue of Oedipus. The second family of views takes knowledge as something different from belief. Knowledge starts where belief gives out. So also Plato's view was that belief is concerned with the changing material world. That is, he meant that the objects which we encounter in our experience can be merely the objects of opinion or doxa. And knowledge. Knowledge deals with something which is not subjected to any change. Ideal forms are the genuine, true, original objects of our knowledge. Yeah? Of course, there are other versions. We can have knowledge of our surroundings, but only when some physical thing is directly present to the mind. Knowledge is a direct relation, while belief is conceived as in a direct relation to the thing believed. We'll start with this traditional analysis. I think it's quite relevant. We may take it as the basic fundamental assumption. You see? The classical definition of knowledge, the classical one, it goes in the following way. Knowledge can be analyzed into three major constituents, which are called the conditions of knowledge. Some belief, which is true and justified. So you can't know something unless that thing is true, you believe it, and you are justified in believing it. These are all necessary conditions for knowledge. You see, that's the initial definition. That definition is assumed to be the classical one. You see, this definition was elaborated within the framework of so-called classical epistemology. And of course, nowadays this definition has been critically reconsidered. You see. Nevertheless, we can take it as the starting point in our epistemological reflections. Yeah, it has some value, of course. It has some value. So, for instance, Roderick Milton Chisholm, an American philosopher known for his work on epistemology, metaphysics, free will, value theory, he held the following views of the fundamental conditions of knowledge. S knows that P if S accepts P, so he uses this term, acceptance, which gives expression to some propositional attitude to the object in question. Second, S has adequate evidence for P, and P is true. Or alternative model, introduced by Alfred Jules Ayer, an English philosopher. And he determined the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge as follows. S knows that if P is true, S is sure that P is true. That's just like believing that P is true with certainty, yeah? And S has the right to be sure that P is true. That is analogous to justification, to having justification, yeah? You see that those definitions, they have some specific differences, but they converge, and they have been worked out within the framework of this paradigmatic model, that knowledge is justified through belief. So these are three major conditions of knowledge. Truth, yeah, since false propositions cannot be known, for something to count as knowledge, it must actually be true. To ascribe knowledge to someone is to credit that person with having got things right. And you know, as Aristotle famously expressed the idea of truth, to say of something which is that it is not, and to say of something which is not that it is false. However, to say of something which is that it is, or of something which is not that it is not, is true. Belief condition also, so great importance. Belief, because one cannot know something that one doesn't even believe in. The statement X, or I know X, but I don't believe that X is true, is contradictory. I must believe it. Anyway, if I claim to know that St. Petersburg is situated somewhere to the north of Moscow, yeah, I must believe this. This is my propositional attitude. So to say that someone has knowledge is to credit that person with a certain kind of success, but for it to be your success, then belief in the proposition in question is essential, since otherwise this success is not credible to you at all. And finally, the most controversial condition is so-called justification, yeah? Justification. Justificatory conditions. No, justification is needed to turn true belief into knowledge, to demonstrate that our belief is based on some grounds, that there were some rational reasons for believing that. True belief by itself is not sufficient for knowledge, for a belief can be true due to luck. Or we can just acquire this belief through the exercise of some unreliable process of producing beliefs. But accidentally it may turn out to be true. But a belief being true because of luck is commonly considered incompatible with beliefs being an instance of knowledge. Yeah? That's why we add these fundamental conditions such as justification, the requirement of our beliefs. They must be justified anyway somehow. See? Okay. So, belief, of course, aims at the truth. That's our epistemic goal. When we believe a proposition, we believe it to be true. When what we believe is true, then there is a match between what we think is and the case, what we think is the case and what is the case. So we have got things right. But it is wrong to think that knowledge is nothing more than true belief. It is wrong to think that knowledge is more than getting things right. Yeah, I'd like to cite Duncan Pritchard. Duncan Pritchard is a contemporary epistemologist working at the University of Edinburgh. In order to show that knowledge involves a kind of success that is credible to the agent, we can use the metaphor of a skilled archer. Imagine that one's belief is an arrow which is aimed at the center of the target truth. Hitting the bull's eye and forming a true belief suffices for getting things right, since all this means is that one was successful on that occasion. But it doesn't suffice, however, for having knowledge, any more than hitting the bull's eye purely by chance. This indicates that this actually cannot be taken as the indication that you are skilled in archery. To have knowledge, one's success must genuinely be the result of one's efforts, rather than merely being by chance. Yeah? Only then is that success creditable to one. This means that forming one's belief in the way that one does not usually in those circumstances to true belief. So, you know, that's an interesting fact. Plato, Plato, in his famous book, The Meno, it's a dialogue written by Plato, he compares knowledge to the statues of the ancient Greek sculptor Daedalus. These statues were so realistic that if one didn't tether them to the ground, they would run away. And Plato's point is that that's a metaphorical image, really. Plato's point is that mere true belief is like one of the untethered statues of Daedalus, in that one could very easily lose it. Knowledge, in contrast, is akin to a tethered statue, one that is therefore not easily lost. So mere true belief, just like an untethered statue of Daedalus, is more likely to be lost. It is more likely to run away than knowledge, which is far more stable. And the true belief one holds when one has knowledge is far more likely to remain fast in response to changes in circumstances. And knowledge is more stable than mere true belief. Yeah? And that's a matter of epistemological inquiry, you see? Because epistemologists, they try to explain what needs to be added to mere true belief in order to get knowledge. Whether we should refer to some justification or evidence, or simply just try to inquire into the fact that our beliefs are produced by some reliable cognitive process. So that's very essential and very important distinction. Just consider the following case. Supposing I want to find my way to the nearest restaurant in an unfamiliar city. And imagine, for instance, that I found out where the nearest restaurant was by reading a map of the town. But that map was entirely fake. Yeah? And suppose further, however, that as it happens, this map inadvertently shows me the right route to the nearest restaurant. Therefore, I have a true belief about where the nearest restaurant is. But I clearly lack knowledge of this fact. Yeah? Because my belief is only likely true. So long as I find the nearest restaurant, what does it matter that I don't know where it is, but merely have a true belief about where it is. So the problem with mere true belief, however, is that unlike knowledge, it is very unstable. So that means that, of course, we may rely on our beliefs and we can be practically successful, but our practical success is not the indicator of our having knowledge, of this actual state of having knowledge. Because we can be successful due to some chance or accidentally, you see. Okay, let's go further. I'd like to point out the fundamental features of propositional knowledge, and I'd like to follow the lines of reasoning of Nicholas Resche, a rather respected epistemologist. First of all, what are the major characteristics of propositional knowledge? Truth commitment, yeah? Only the truth can be known. If someone knows that P, then P must be true. It simply makes no sense to say, I know that P, but it might not be true. Or X knows that P, but it might not be true. You see? Truth commitment is the fundamental one. What else? Also, grounding. Knowledge must be appropriately grounded. A person may accept something without a reason, but cannot then be said to know it. It makes no sense to say X knows that P, but has no sufficient grounds for thinking so. This makes sense to talk about justification as a necessary condition for knowledge. You see? What else? Reflexivity. To attribute a specific item of propositional knowledge to someone else is ipso facto to claim it for oneself. It makes no sense to say you know that P, but I don't. One can be generic about it and say you know various things that I don't, but one cannot be specific about it and identify these items. To characterize such as knowledge is to assert one's own entitlement to it. And coherence. Since all items of propositional knowledge must be true, they must, in consequence, be collectively coherent. Yeah? It cannot be that X knows that P, but that Y knows that not P. Yeah? Since we are committed to the principle that the truth is consistent, the truth commitment of knowledge demands its consistency. Okay, let's examine, the knowledge is the product of some cognitive activity. And when we are talking about cognitive activity, we're approaching the issue of the sources of knowledge, because knowledge is somehow generated, yeah, through the exercise of our abilities. So cognitive activity is the activity of people aimed at producing new knowledge based on the achievement of past generation. That's a general definition. I'd like to draw your attention to some matrix which demonstrates the specific features of the sources of knowledge. But I don't want just to analyze those sources, because primarily the major concern of epistemology is first of all to analyze the concept of knowledge, and then after that to make account of the origin of our knowledge. And so we have to choose between these priorities, and my choice is first of all to pay particular attention to the analysis of the concept of knowledge, and after that we can deal with the issue of determining the status of different sources of knowledge. And, for instance, perception, knowledge of empirical facts about the physical world involves perception. Reasoning, all knowledge requires some amount of reasoning, the analysis of data and the drawing of inferences. Intuition is often believed to be a sort of direct access to knowledge of the a priori, for instance. Memory allows us to know something that we knew in the past, even perhaps if no longer remember the original justification. And testimony, sometimes we can rely on testimony with us. Just recall Aurelius Augustine and his account of faith and testimony. You see? And what might be theories of knowledge acquisition? Yeah. In brief, I'd like to make this brief outline: theories of knowledge acquisition, or the strategies, or the paradigmatic models. Yeah. Of this knowledge acquisition. Empiricism. That's one paradigmatic strategy. Empiricism holds that experience is crucial for knowledge or justified true belief. Experience about a particular world. Yeah, of course, empiricists, they differ with regard to the nature of experience and about experience relationship to concepts and beliefs. According to some empiricists, the content of all concepts is ultimately derived from experience. Although defenders of rationalism, they argue that attempts to connect experience with concepts are inadequate. There are lots of universal abstract concepts. As I told you, for instance, George Bertrand developed his representative theory of abstraction in order to account for the meaning of the universal terms and how they're related to the particular perceptions. Yeah. Or John Locke, for instance. We've got accustomed to treat John Locke as the major representative of empiricism, but actually, to be true, John Locke, to some extent, followed the tradition of René Descartes. And he was more disposed to constructivism. He was empiricist insofar he claimed that experience provides the basis for our concepts. So he was a concept empiricist. But beside that, he discriminated between three major kinds of knowledge: intuitive knowledge, empirical knowledge, based on sense experience, and discursive knowledge, based on reasoning and argumentation. Yeah? And he claimed that intuitive knowledge is the most trustworthy. So, nevertheless, John Locke still remains one of the prominent figures in modern philosophy. He contributed greatly to this view that all our concepts originate out of experience, and that we combine and find relations between our concepts or ideas. And these are the major constituents of knowledge. Ideas and concepts somehow related with each other. Rationalism holds that reason is the most important, or perhaps the only means of acquiring knowledge. Knowledge is not derived from experience, but rather is acquired by a priori process or is innate in the form of concepts, or intuitive. Are justified in believing that we have innate ideas. I get that we are justified in believing that we have dispositions, innate dispositions to form certain ideas, certain representations of external objects. Yeah. So we are disposed to think in a certain way. Yeah. But there's no such thing as a ready-made innate idea in our minds. We've got certain behavioral dispositions here, and cognitive dispositions as well. And these dispositions are innate, of course. So rationalists disagree about the nature of reason and the role of experience in epistemology, and some of the rationalists regard mathematics as the paradigm of knowledge. For instance, René Descartes was the prominent figure of this classical rationalism, yeah, and appreciated mathematics and axiomatic structure of knowledge is the model for other epistemic or doxastic systems. And some rationalists argue that all knowledge arises from a small set of truths known by means of reason, along with the principles of deduction. So among the philosophers commonly regarded as rationalists, René Descartes, Benedictus Spinoza, Gottfried Leibniz, for instance, consider these three main claims of classical rationalism. Yeah? Intuition, deduction. Some propositions are known by us by intuition alone. Others are knowable by being deduced from intuitive propositions, which are taken as the axiomatic basis for our knowledge. And some rationalists, they take intuition to be infallible, claiming that whatever we intuit must be true. Others allow for the possibility of false intuitive propositions. Yeah? Some rationalists claim that only mathematics can be knowable by intuition and deduction. And some claim that ethical truth can also be intuited. Innate knowledge. We have knowledge of some truth as part of our innate rational nature. Experience may trigger a process by which we bring this knowledge to consciousness. But the experiences don't provide us with the knowledge itself, yeah? Which has in some way been with us all along. And innate concepts, some of the concepts, as opposed to actual knowledge we employ, are part of our innate rational nature. Some rationalists would argue, however, that innate concepts are entailed by innate knowledge or innate dispositions to certain cognitive behavior. Transcendentalism, that's another very interesting and influential paradigm. I'd like to draw attention to Immanuel Kant. He was the prominent thinker and a leading figure in modern philosophy, the age of enlightenment. And he laid foundations of classical transcendentalism, making account of the conditions of the very possibility of experience and knowledge. His famous work, Critique of Pure Reason. Kant seeks to separate genuine, a priori knowledge, which defends against skeptical attacks, from false claims of such knowledge. And he begins by setting forth the distinctions between a priori and empirical knowledge, and necessary and contingent propositions, analytic and synthetic judgments. So the necessary contingent distinction yields the same division of propositions as the a priori and empirical. A priori propositions are necessary. Contingent propositions or synthetic propositions are empirical propositions. Yeah? So a judgment is analytic only if its predicate is included in the subject concept, and synthetic if the predicate is not included in the subject concept. For instance, all corporeal objects are extended objects, because extension, this is the property which can be identified and picked out through the analysis of the concept of corporeal body. It is implicit in the contents of this concept. And this judgment is a very good exemplar of analytic judgment or analytic proposition or synthetic proposition. The closest subway or metro station is 15 minutes off from the university. Yeah? We have to synthesize these concepts on the basis of experience, making some measurements. You see? So the primary task undertaken in his work is to determine how such synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. Basically, what he had in mind is to justify such claims which form the basis for our scientific knowledge. For instance, mathematical truth or geometrical truth. Also some assumptions underlying physical research projects. For instance, we assume that everything which happens must have its cause. Yeah? So this is a priori but synthetic proposition. The goal of Kant to explain the possibility of those propositions being true. And Kant argues that knowledge results from a combination of intuitions and concepts. Concepts which are manipulated by our mental faculty of understanding represent objects in virtue of shared features. Intuitions, which are the province of our mental faculty of sensing, directly represent single objects or states of affairs. Yeah? You know, concepts are categories, intuitions such as space and time. That's how we intuit things. Yeah? Copernican revolution. You know, Kant's approach is to the issue of a priori knowledge is so innovative that Kant himself calls it Copernican revolution. Yes, Copernicus sought to explain the movement of stars and planets in terms of the motion of the earthbound observer, rather than in terms of the motions of the heavenly bodies. And similar, instead of focusing on the nature of the synthetic a priori judgment, Kant examines the nature of the conscious mind of the knower. Yeah? We've got intuition. Space and time are not objective features of reality, but these are just a priori forms of intuition built into our cognitive apparatus. All spatial and temporal features of objects are said to be features of appearances in the mind, and not of the objects as they are in themselves. And this emphasis on appearance is the key to his transcendental idealism. We form judgments on the basis of pure intuition while applying concepts or categories to the objects of intuition. So objects are somehow appear to us, and we simply systematize and categorize those objects. So we just build them into a certain pre-established scheme. First of all, the scheme of spatial intention and temporal succession. Space and time are the forms of our intuition, some a priori forms of intuition. And then we just make use of the matrix of categories, such as substance, cause effect, substance property, and so on. So noble objects are shared by this faculty of intuition, and it allows us to have synthetic a priori knowledge of them. Knowledge arises due to the combination of our empirical intuitions and our a priori meaningful concepts. Yeah? Some concepts are themselves a priori rather than abstracted from experience. Kant calls them categories. They include the concepts of substance, cause, temporal relations, or events. You see, and for example, the concepts of cause and substance are required for any possible experience. So we're trying to inquire into the foundations of our knowledge. Kant tries to highlight these a priori structures which determine and constitute the conditions of the very possibility of experience of knowledge, and that is called transcendental approach. You see? But actually, we do not represent the world as it is. We simply construct the world out of the material of which we attend due to our empirical intuitions, and which we simply organize and arrange according to the a priori forms of categorical reasoning. I think that transcendentalism matches the idea of constructivism, but now constructivism is associated with some modern recent trends of pragmatism or this relativism. So that means that constructivism, that's another paradigmatic strategy. Constructivism presupposes that views, all of our, it presupposes that views and our beliefs are constructed So that it is contingent on convention, human perception, social experience, you see. Our knowledge doesn't necessarily reflect an external or transcendent realities, you see. The construct point of view is both pragmatic and relativistic in nature. I mean that the recently developed constructivist epistemologies. It opposes positivism and scientificism, that it maintains that scientific knowledge is constructed by scientists and not discovered from the world through strict scientific methods. So constructivism holds that there is no single valid methodology. And the common point in all forms of constructivism is that they don't focus on an ontological reality as it is in itself. And Kant followed this line of reasoning. Also, he thought that things in themselves are inaccessible to us. We are dealing merely with appearance, with how things appear to us. Yeah? Constructivists claim that we simply construct reality. And Immanuel Kant showed that we can construct reality on the basis of the input from the outside, yeah, from the external world. But we should make use of our abilities. We should make use of a priori forms of intuition and categorical thinking. See? A little bit more realistic view is that of representationalism, yeah? Or indirect realism. Sometimes it is claimed to be an epistemological dualism. Yeah? So, representationalism holds that the world we see in conscious experience is not the real world itself, but merely a miniature virtual reality replica of the world. Internal representation, yeah? Internal representation, as if we are just sitting somewhere in a theater, yeah? We can use this metaphorical image, yeah? So we know only our ideas or interpretations or representations of the objects in the world. You know, because there's a veil of perception, a certain barrier between the mind and the existing world. And this barrier prevents first-hand knowledge of anything beyond it. So our ideas come from sense data or images of real material external world. So they can take this realistic assumption. But the immediate direct object of perception is only sense data that represents the external object. Yeah? So representationalists argue the case in the following. Just from the epistemological fact that it is impossible to have experience beyond the sensory surface. They argue their case from the fact that dreams, hallucination, and visual illusions clearly indicate that the world of experience is not the same thing as the world itself. And from the evidence of phenomenal perspective, the curvature of perceived space, for instance, such as the apparent convergence of parallel road sides, for example. And they argue that it's clearly not a property of the world itself, but only of our perception representation. So these are the strategies, yeah? So, once again, let's turn to this traditional classical analysis of knowledge. So the traditional, we are going to remind you of this view. It takes those conditions of knowledge to the basic. They are necessary and mutually sufficient, yeah, for the determination of the state of having knowledge. Having true belief, which is justified. The question is, are these three conditions sufficient for knowledge? You know, there might be cases here, interesting cases, in which we can satisfy all those three conditions and yet fail to get knowledge, fail to be qualified as having knowledge. This is a logical explication of those counterexamples which fall under the category of the Getty cases. X believes that P is true. X has justification for believing P, for example, because it follows logically from something, say Q, that he also believes, but although in fact Q is false. Yeah? For instance, I believe that Dmitry Yakovlevich, for instance, is in Moscow, because actually I have some evidence for that. I know that Dmitry Yakovlevich told me that he will be in Moscow, on Tuesday, and I know that usually he attends library, and that is not a regular experience. But it turns out to be that, so from this proposition, for which I have some justification, I can infer that Dmitry Yakovlevich is in Moscow, or not in Moscow, in Russia, in Russia, and this proposition is really true, though it turns out to be false to claim that Dmitry Yakovlevich is in Moscow, because he happened to move for some time to St. Petersburg, to participate in a scientific conference, for instance. I'm not aware of that fact, So I have the initial belief, which is justified because I have some evidence. I know that Dmitry Yakovlevich is a reliable person. He told me that he's going to stay in Moscow, and regularly he attends library at the time. So my evidence, I have some reasons, for claiming that that is true, that he is in Moscow. Of course, these reasons are not conclusive. They simply make my belief that he's in Moscow probable. But to have conclusive reasons is not required for having justification. We have to discriminate between conclusive justification and inconclusive justification. Of course, René Descartes followed these strict epistemological standards, and he required us, if we claim to know something, to have some conclusive reasons to know something with certainty. So I have some justification for the fact that Dmitry Yakovlevich is in Moscow, and though this is false. And I make a logical correct inference that if he is in Moscow, then he is in Russian Federation, that he is in Russia. And this is actually true, So I have true belief, which is justified, but I fail to have knowledge. The knowledge cannot be attributed to me. Another case, let it be that someone believes this disjunctive statement. Someone believes P or Q. Q is true, and consequently, according to the laws of logical inference, P or Q is also true. X disbelieves Q, X believes P or Q, but doesn't so only because he believes P, but P is false. So that's an interesting example proposed by Nicholas Resche, for instance, but I can just show you some more examples originally presented by Edmund Gettier in his famous paper, Is Justified True Belief? His knowledge is justified true belief. So X believed that Jefferson succeeded America's first president, George Washington, as president. X accordingly believes that Jefferson or Adams was the second American president, although he thinks that Adams was the third president. Since Adams was in fact the second American president, X believed that Jefferson or Adams was the second American president is indeed true. We've got true belief which is justified, but we lack knowledge. The original statement of those cases, I'll skip a set of slides, okay? They go in the following way. That is called Gettier problem. Dr. Getty is an American philosopher who wrote his famous papers, Justified True Belief Knowledge, and he questioned this traditional concept of knowledge. So he goes in the following way. Just suppose that Smith and Jones have applied for a certain job, and suppose that Smith has strong evidence for the following conjunctive propositions. Jones is the man who will get the job, and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith's evidence for this proposition might be that the president of the company assured him that Jones would in the end be selected, and that he, Smith, had counted the coins in the Jones pocket 10 minutes ago. So this proposition entails the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. So next, let's suppose that Smith sees the entailment from D to E. He can infer from the fact that Jones is the man who will get the job and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket, the proposition that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. And he accepts the proposition, the man who will get the job has 10 coins in the pocket, as being true, yeah, on the basis of this evidence, on the basis of the first statement, and which he believes is true, and he has some justification, he has some reasons which are not conclusive but nevertheless sufficient to claim that it is true, and logical correct inference. But imagine further that unknown to Smith, he himself, not Jones, will get the job. And also unknown to Smith, he himself has 10 coins in his pocket. So proposition, the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, turns out to be true. Yeah? Though proposition from which he just inferred this proposition is false. It is false to claim that John is the man who will get the job and John has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, for the conjunctive propositions to be true, two statements in this conjunctive proposition must be true, not merely one. Yeah? So, that's a very good example. That means that we've got the proposition or belief which is true. Smith believes it, yeah, that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. And he's justified in believing that because he made the logical correct inference. He inferred the proposition that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket from another proposition. Jones is the man who will get the job and John has 10 coins in his pocket. Though this proposition from which the second one was inferred, the first one was inferred, is false. Nevertheless, this inference is logically correct, and Smith has some inconclusive but sufficient reasons to think that proposition D is true, though of course we cannot ascribe him knowledge. That's an interesting. Or just consider another a little bit more simpler case of Getty case. Suppose I'm expecting my brother to visit at any moment, and you tell me, I believe you that you're a reliable person, yeah? You tell me that he has arrived at the door, but you're trying to deceive me into believing this. However, it so happens that he arrived at the moment you attempted a deception. And in this case, my belief is true. I believe it because you told me and I trust you. And you are a reliable person, but that wasn't a joke, yeah? And I have a good reason to believe it. You're a very reliable informant, but I don't know that he has arrived. So that means that we have somehow reconsidered this fundamental initial definition of the conditions of knowledge. At least we should claim that our justification shouldn't involve some false lemurs. Our beliefs shouldn't be based on some false grounds. Or our beliefs must be somehow causally related to the fact. Or our beliefs must be somehow produced by a reliable cognitive process. So there are lots of alternative responses to this Getty problem, and in cause of developing those responses, epistemologists contributed greatly to some non-classical epistemologies, and they just tried to reconsider and to rework this traditional approach to the definition of the conditions of knowledge, and proposed lots of alternative approaches, and this gave rise to a great variety of contemporary epistemologies. But that's the topic of another lecture. So thank you for your attention. That's all.